Before we dive into this story, let me ask you something. Do you believe in ghosts? By the time you finish, you might. If you're captivated by tales of the eerie and the unexplained, hit that like button and subscribe. It's not just a story, it's a warning. What you're about to hear is an account of one of the most horrifying experiences of my life, and trust me, you'll want to stay to the end because some nightmares never fade. And this one, it's still out there, waiting. Now let me tell you about the night I boarded a ship I wish I'd never found. What I'm about to share isn't just a story, it's a warning. Something I lived through, something I still see in my nightmares. And if you ever find yourself tempted by the call of the unknown, remember my words. Some things are better left undiscovered. Chapter 1. The Call. It started with a job offer, one that sounded too good to be true. I was a freelance salvage hunter, someone who scours wrecks for valuables. The pay wasn't great, but I loved the thrill of discovery. Then Mitch called. Mitch was my old boss, the kind of guy who'd sell his soul for a quick buck. I hadn't worked with him in years, but his voice over the phone sounded urgent. "Got a lead for you, Jack," he said. "Big one. Ever heard of the Elysian Queen?" I hadn't, and I told him so. "Luxury liner," Mitch continued. "Went missing in 1932. Never found. There's a rumor it's been spotted drifting near the Bermuda Triangle. But here's the kicker. Multiple vessels have disappeared near those coordinates since it reappeared. No survivors." "And that's supposed to sell me on this?" I asked, half joking. But the unease in my chest wasn't going anywhere. "Look," Mitch said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "This isn't just about the treasure. The Elysian Queen has legends tied to it. Curses, ancient artifacts, stuff people would kill for. If it's legit, we're not talking millions, Jack. We're talking history." Something about it didn't sit right with me. Legends like that rarely end well. But Mitch was persuasive, and the payout was tempting. Against my better judgment, I agreed. After all, history doesn't scare me. At least, that's what I told myself. Chapter 2. Assembling the crew. The team was small. Mitch, me, a diver named Sam, and Ethan, a tech guy Mitch had brought in to handle the sonar and drones. Mitch also dragged along his niece, Sarah, a rookie eager to prove herself. She didn't belong out there, but Mitch brushed off my concerns. "She'll be fine," he said. "Besides, we need the extra hands." We set out on Mitch's boat, the Seeker, with a mix of excitement and unease. The excitement came from the possibility of a massive find, but the unease, that was harder to pin down. As we approached the coordinates, the world around us seemed to change. The air grew dense, like we were breathing through a wet cloth, and the sky turned an unnatural shade of gray, casting an eerie, colorless light over the ocean. Even the waves seemed wrong, not crashing or churning, just softly undulating, as if something beneath them was trying not to disturb the surface. By the time the ship's shadow appeared through the mist, an oppressive silence had settled over us. No one spoke. Even Mitch, ever the optimist, was gripping the wheel tighter than usual. It felt as though we were being watched, not by one thing, but by hundreds, maybe thousands, of unseen eyes. And still, the Elysian Queen loomed ahead, silent and waiting. Chapter 3. The First Glimpse. We spotted the ship just before dusk. The Elysian Queen loomed out of the fog like a floating mausoleum. The air grew unnaturally still, and the only sound was the soft lap of water against its barnacle-encrusted hull. A faint, metallic groaning echoed from deep within the ship, as though the very structure was alive and in pain. As we drew closer, the fog seemed to thicken unnaturally, coiling around the ship like a protective veil. A sudden, icy breeze swept past us, carrying with it a sour, briny stench that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just the smell. It felt like the ship was exhaling, a deep and mournful sigh, warning us to turn back before it was too late. Its hull was encrusted with barnacles, its once grand exterior now a decaying ruin. But it was intact, too intact for a ship that had been missing for nearly a century. The portholes seemed to glimmer faintly, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement inside. A shadow flitting past the glass. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. Jackpot, Mitch muttered, his eyes gleaming. His excitement seemed out of place, almost manic, as though he couldn't feel the dread settling over the rest of us. As we approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed along the edges of the Seeker's railings, something impossible in the balmy ocean air. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The closer we got, the more oppressive the air became, heavy with an unseen weight. It felt like the ship wasn't just watching us. It was waiting. Chapter 4. Boarding the Queen. We boarded just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The deck was slick with algae, the air thick with the smell of decay and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like rusted blood. Every step felt wrong, as if the ship didn't want us there. Inside, the ship was eerily preserved. Plates sat on dining tables, covered in a fine layer of dust, but the chairs around the tables were askew, as if abandoned mid-meal. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dull but intact, swaying ever so slightly despite the still air. It was like stepping into a time capsule, yet there was an undeniable sense that we were not alone. Then the whispers started. At first I thought I was imagining it. Faint voices, just at the edge of hearing, soft and indistinct, like the echo of a crowded room in the distance. But when I saw Sarah freeze, her eyes wide and unblinking, I knew she heard them too. Her hand trembled as she gripped her flashlight tighter, the beam shaking against the decayed walls. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her breath came out in shallow puffs, visible in the inexplicable cold that seemed to seep from the walls. Mitch waved it off, but even his usual bravado was subdued. "Just the wind," he said, though his eyes darted nervously down the corridor ahead. "Come on, let's keep moving." The whispering grew louder as we walked, the words still unintelligible but now layered, overlapping, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I felt a cold breath against the back of my neck, and when I turned, there was nothing there. But I swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting away into the deeper darkness. It wasn't the wind, and I knew Mitch was lying. Chapter 5. The Ballroom. The ballroom was the crown jewel of the Elysian Queen. Its floors were a mosaic of shattered glass and rotting wood, its grand staircase curling up into the shadows. But the mirrors, they were wrong. Each one reflected the room as it had been, pristine and vibrant. And in the reflections, people danced. Their movements were fluid, but unnaturally stiff, like puppets on strings. A faint, scratchy tune floated through the air, a warped waltz that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Interspersed with the music were bursts of distorted laughter, high-pitched and broken, as if the mirrors themselves were mocking us. The longer I stared, the more the dancers' faces became clear, their features twisting into grotesque masks of joy that bordered on madness. Elegant couples in vintage attire, their faces obscured by shadows, spun faster and faster until their movements blurred. Sam stepped closer to one of the mirrors, her breath fogging the glass. "They're moving," she said, her voice trembling. Her words barely reached us over the rising crescendo of the warped waltz. The dancers' heads snapped toward her reflection, their hollow eyes locking onto her as if in recognition. The rest of us saw it too. The dancers weren't just reflections. They were watching us. Their movements became jerky and unnatural, their hands pressing against the glass. Cracks spiderwebbed across the mirrors, and a low, guttural groaning came from deep within the walls. I stumbled back as one of the dancers' hands punched through the mirror, its elongated fingers clawing the air, searching for something, searching for us. The music screeched to a halt, replaced by a deafening silence that made my ears ring. Then came the whispers, soft and malevolent, growing louder with every second. "Stay. Dance. Forever." Chapter 6. The haunting begins. Things escalated quickly. Ethan's drone malfunctioned the moment he launched it. Sam claimed she felt someone grab her arm, though no one was there. And then there was the dining room. Sarah screamed when she saw it. The long table, once empty, was now piled with rotting food. The smell hit us first, a nauseating mix of decay and sulfur, so thick it felt like it was clawing its way down my throat. The maggots writhing in the decayed meat made an unbearable squelching sound, a wet, pulsing rhythm that seemed almost alive. Flies buzzed in frenzied swarms, their droning hum growing louder as though they were trying to drown out our breaths. The table creaked under the weight of the grotesque feast, and I swear I saw one of the chairs shift slightly, as if something unseen had just sat down to join the banquet. The air grew colder with every passing second, and as my flashlight swept across the chairs, I saw them. Figures, skeletal and rotting, sat rigidly in their seats, dressed in tattered finery. Their empty eye sockets were fixed on us, but there was something worse. Their hands. Thin, bony fingers twitched, tapping against the table as if impatient. When I blinked, the figures snapped their heads toward us in unison, the sudden movement making my heart lurch. Their jaws opened wide, impossibly wide, but no sound came out, just an oppressive, suffocating silence that pressed down on my chest. Then, one of them moved. The figure closest to me, a woman whose gown clung to her decayed body, began to rise. Her movements were jerky, like a marionette being lifted by invisible strings. Her head lolled to the side, and a sickening cracking sound echoed as her neck twisted unnaturally. I stumbled backward, colliding with Ethan, who had frozen in place, his face pale as death. The whispers started then, low and guttural, growing louder with every second. "Join us," they said, a chorus of raspy voices overlapping. "Join us at the feast." Chapter 7. The Captain's Quarters. In the captain's quarters, we found a logbook. The entries started normal enough, detailing the ship's maiden voyage. The crew and passengers, it seemed, were celebrating a promising journey, until the tone changed. By the halfway point, the handwriting had grown frantic. The ink smeared as though written by a trembling hand. "They're everywhere," one entry read. "Watching, waiting. We should never have taken it." Another entry described crew members going missing, only for their screams to echo from the lower decks. "The shadows move," it said. "They are alive, hungry, thirsting for what we took." Then came the final entry, the ink thick and bleeding into the paper. "Blood for the sea." Suddenly, the room grew cold, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into my bones. A low creak, almost imperceptible, came from behind the door, followed by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. They didn't sound human. The dragging, scraping noise that followed was worse, like something metallic being pulled across the floor. The doorknob began to twist slowly, the faint click of its turning sending shivers down my spine. Mitch, trying to mask his unease, flung the door open, but there was nothing there. Nothing except deep, wet footprints leading away. Too large to be human, each one pooling with seawater that reeked of decay. I could swear, just before Mitch slammed the door shut again, I heard a deep, rattling exhale, as if something enormous was breathing just out of sight. Chapter 8. Descent into Madness. The ship seemed alive. Hallways stretched into infinity, their walls shifting and twisting like the ship was breathing. Doors slammed shut on their own with thunderous echoes that seemed to come from all directions. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were right next to us. They weren't words anymore, but guttural sounds, like a low growl mixed with faint sobbing. Sam disappeared first. One moment she was with us. The next, she was gone. We found her dive gear by the pool, but no trace of her. The water rippled as if something had just submerged, leaving a faint trail of bubbles. When I leaned closer, I could swear I saw a pale hand, skeletal and impossibly long, retreat into the black depths. Ethan started talking to himself, muttering about shadows. He claimed they were moving, reaching out to him, and he began flinching at every flicker of light. His paranoia turned into frantic pacing, and soon he refused to move forward. "They're in the walls," he whispered, his eyes darting around wildly. "They're waiting for us to stop looking." Mitch, on the other hand, was consumed by his greed, convinced the treasure was nearby. He ignored the growing tension, his fixation on finding what was owed to him. overriding every shred of common sense. And Sarah wasn't Sarah anymore. Her eyes were vacant, her voice hollow, and she spoke in fragmented sentences that didn't make sense, repeating phrases like, "They're already inside," and "the sea has no end." At one point, she smiled at me, but her smile stretched too far, splitting the corners of her mouth like tearing fabric. Her teeth seemed sharper, longer, and her face was no longer entirely hers. When I stepped back, her head twitched violently, and she began humming a distorted melody that made my skin crawl. The air grew heavier, filled with a low-frequency hum that vibrated through my chest, like the ship itself was alive and angry. Every step we took seemed to echo into an abyss, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were being herded, pushed deeper into the labyrinth of its corridors. Whatever was on this ship, it wasn't just haunting it was controlling it. Chapter 9. The Ritual. We pieced together the truth from the logbook and the ship's eerie decor. The Elysian Queen had carried something cursed, a relic stolen from a temple deep in the Amazon, a black obsidian idol with cruel jagged edges and an unsettling, almost pulsating aura. The crew had tried to use it to summon wealth, but instead they unleashed something ancient and hungry, something that thrived on despair and blood. The log described desperate attempts to appease it, offerings made, passengers sacrificed. The final captain's note warned, "It demands everything. There is no escape." As we read those words, the air in the room grew heavier, and the faint sound of water dripping became deafening. I swore I could feel the ship shudder beneath my feet, as if it remembered the horrors it had witnessed. To break the curse, we had to return the relic to the sea, but the ship wouldn't let us leave. Doors slammed shut with violent force. Shadows, thick and impenetrable, pooled in the corners and began creeping toward us, stretching along the walls like tendrils of ink. And the dancers in the mirrors, they started pounding on the glass, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of rage and agony. Cracks spread like spiderwebs across the surface, and through them came a faint, chilling voice. "You took it. You must pay." Chapter 10. The Final Stand. The relic was hidden in the ballroom, beneath the floorboards. As we retrieved it, the dancers in the mirrors came alive, stepping out of the glass with the sound of shattering ice, each crack like a scream in the silence. Their movements were grotesque, joints bending in reverse, limbs jerking unnaturally as though they were marionettes controlled by a sadistic puppeteer. Their hollow eyes locked onto us, their jaws clicking open and shut in rhythm with the sound of splintering mirror shards. The air filled with a distorted melody, warped and discordant, as though the very ship was singing its own funeral dirge. The closer they moved, the colder the room became, frost creeping along the floorboards, and with every step they took, the room seemed to groan as if it too was alive. Their forms twisted further, the glass shards embedding into their flesh, shimmering like jagged ornaments. One dancer's head lolled to the side, the neck snapping audibly as it twisted unnaturally to face me. Another dragged itself forward, its hands leaving smears of blackened ichor across the frost-covered floorboards. They clawed at us, their fingers sharp like daggers and dripping with a dark, tar-like substance that hissed and bubbled where it touched the wood. Mitch, consumed by his greed, tried to wrestle the relic away, shouting, "It's mine! It's worth everything!" He paid the price for his obsession. Chains lashed out from the shadows, serpentine and alive, wrapping around his limbs with a sickening crunch. The shadows dragged him into the darkness as he screamed, his voice echoing long after he was gone. For a moment, the dancers paused, their heads tilting in eerie unison, as though savoring the sound. Then they turned back to us. Chapter 11. Escape. Sarah and I made it to the deck, clutching the relic. The ship seemed to fight us, the wind howling and the water churning violently, as if the very ocean were trying to pull us back. Shadows danced along the edges of the deck, twisting into grotesque shapes that reached for us with claw-like tendrils. The sound of the ship groaning beneath our feet became deafening, like the final breaths of a dying beast. We hurled the relic into the sea with all our strength, its obsidian surface gleaming briefly before vanishing beneath the waves. For a moment, everything went still. The howling wind and violent waters suddenly silenced, replaced by an eerie, oppressive quiet that made my heart pound in my ears. Then the ship began to decay rapidly, its walls crumbling as if centuries of rot and corrosion were catching up in an instant. The ornate railings splintered, the masts collapsed, and the entire structure groaned as it began to sink. We barely made it back to the Seeker, stumbling aboard just as the Elysian Queen was swallowed by the waves. As it sank, I saw the dancers one last time, their faces pressed against the portholes, their hollow eyes burning with hatred and sorrow. Their mouths moved silently, as though screaming curses we could not hear. The final sight was their outstretched hands, clawing desperately against the glass before the darkness of the ocean consumed them. Chapter 12. Aftermath. No one believed us when we got back. The authorities said Mitch's boat was never found, that there was no record of a distress signal. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, and when I look out at the ocean, I see it, a dark shape in the fog, waiting. Last night, it was closer. I swear I saw lights flickering in the mist, and for just a moment, I heard it. That warped melody from the ballroom, faint but unmistakable. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. But the whispers, they stayed, growing louder as if the ship was calling me back. Conclusion: if you ever hear about a ship that seems too good to be true, don't go looking for it. Some things are lost for a reason. And if you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through this haunting tale. If you enjoyed it, please like this video, leave a comment about what gave you chills, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you awake at night. Share this with someone who loves the thrill of the unknown, and together, we can keep these tales alive. Until next time, stay safe, and stay out of the fog, and stay